program is made possible by the Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College, CUNY.
Trust your broker? Not likely. Not if you've been hearing the steady drumbeat of bad news about the mutual fund business. It turns out some big traders haven't been playing by the same rules as you and I have, and as a result, they've been making money hand over fist at our expense. Meanwhile, many brokers have been selling us on funds that aren't all that great, not mentioning that they got paid extra to do so. What about the directors who were supposed to act on our behalf? They didn't have a clue, and neither did the regulators. How did all this happen? I'm Sarah Bartlett. Join me today on USA Inc. Joining us today is John Bogle, the founder and former chairman of the Vanguard Group, the second largest mutual fund company in America. Jack has a reputation for being a champion of shareholders and a critic of many mutual fund practices. Jack, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be with you, Sarah.
Good. Well, I hope the first thing you can do is explain to us what exactly has been going on, especially with this trading abuses that have been coming into the press. Can you help us understand that?
There are basically two kinds of trading abuses out there. One is what we call time zone trading, which is trading in international mutual funds because the prices are often set in, for example, the Japanese market many hours before the U.S. market closes, and therefore the prices that the mutual fund reports at the close of the day in the U.S. are in effect 12 hours old. So you have a pretty good idea of whether the market's going to be up or down based on what the U.S. market has been doing in the afternoon. So you can buy or sell, in a certain sense, those funds and get a price that gives you an advantage over the long-term investors in the fund. And then you can redeem those shares later on at presumably an improved price. It's not illegal. I think it's quite unethical, and I don't think mutual funds should allow investors to do that. But it goes on. It's being cut back a lot now with all the attention that it's been given. But that's one kind. The other.
Let me just stop you for a second. What kind of scale has this been happening? I mean, is this something that investors should really be concerned about? Is it a big deal?
It's a big deal in terms of the amounts of money that change hands in all this, the amounts of capital flows the funds have to deal with. And there are many funds, for example, like a $2 billion fund might have $2 billion of redemptions in a single year. People put $2 billion in, take $2 billion out, and the fund is the same size at the end of the year as at the beginning. So it's expensive in terms of transaction costs, and it's expensive in terms of dilution of the interests of the long-term shareholders in terms of the price break that those traders get. The other kind is illegal, and it's what we call late trading, and that is, you know, where the market closed at 4 o'clock, U.S. stock market closed, say 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and so you don't buy or sell your funds then, but maybe at 8 o'clock at night, let's assume some big event took place between 4 and 8, you have a very good idea if there's a major change in the market's prospects. You can make your trade at the 4 o'clock price, knowing that much more than the person that did the trading at 4 knows. And that's simply fraudulent. It's been done at great length by a lot of people. Usually the manager is getting a great advantage, the fund management company is getting a great advantage, because that management company is not only allowing this person to trade, but that person, as a quid pro quo for the management company, will, for example, put a lot of money in the manager's other funds. They call them sticky assets, maybe the manager's money market fund, for example. And so the manager is getting paid over there for letting the interests of the shareholders he's duty-bound to protect be diluted over here.
So there's a real conflict between the interests of the shareholders and the interests of investors in this kind of a situation.
There's not only a real conflict, but the great thing about these scandals in both cases is the spotlight that illuminates those really shoddy practices, illuminates all the narrow little and nibbling around the edges of proper ethical conduct that have, I'm sorry to say, gone on throughout the mutual fund industry in which the shareholders' interests have been compromised.
Now, as I understand it, it's not just trading that's been a problem. It's been the way that these mutual funds have been sold, the sales practices. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, sales practices are a different issue, but I think the simplest way to look at that is most, probably 3/4 or so of all mutual fund sales are made through broker-dealers. And funds have, it's a little bit complicated, but they have two classes of shares. One, which we'll call the A shares, you pay a 6% commission when you buy in and then pay the regular management fees for the rest of the time you hold the fund. The other, called B shares, you pay that 6%, nothing at the beginning, but pay the B shares 1% a year for 6 years. Seems like an even trade. The problem that's cropped up is people that invest larger amounts of money, $50,000 say, where they could get a 4% sales commission, or $100,000 where they could get a 2 3/4% sales commission, have apparently been sold the A shares, subject of the B shares, which have the high price for everybody. Instead of buying the cheap A shares, the reduced discount on the A shares, they're paying for the high prices in the B shares. So they've been badly overcharged. That's part of the scandal. The other part is that there's payments being made to brokers in return for them selling a particular manager's fund.
So if I understand you, then if I'm getting a recommendation from a broker that says you've really got to consider this fund, it might be that that broker really doesn't think it's the best fund for me, but he's looking at his bottom line and he's saying, I'm going to get a lot more money if I recommend this. Is that what's been going on?
Well, yeah, in a way that's what's going on, but it's probably a little more subtle than that, and that is those extra commissions persuade the broker to think it's the best fund for you.
Okay. All right.
You know, in a funny sense, yeah, it's a subtle distinction, but you know, we always want to believe what's in our own economic interest to believe. So it's not as if they're committing some kind of a direct fraud, but rather their opinions are being shaped by the amount of commissions they make.
Again, there's a conflict of interest between how they're being trained to make advice to investors. Now, the mutual fund industry doesn't seem to me to be full of crooks, or, I mean, this is not a tawdry industry. How is it that these abuses, could have been so rampant?
Well, that's actually a great question, and the way I often put it, Sarah, is I have never met a corrupt person in this business. Turns out there are some. I just didn't happen to have met them. But in general, I've never met a corrupt person in the mutual fund industry. But I'm afraid the industry itself is structured in a way that I would describe as corrupt. And that is to say, we have allowed a structure to grow up in this industry in which the interests of the managers are favored over the interests of fund shareholders. And it's a curious and actually kind of perverse thing that the Investment Company Act of 1940, our guiding statute, now 64 or 5 years old, says mutual funds must be organized, operated, and managed in the interest of shareholders and not in the interest of their investment managers.
So
that's not happening.
Is that the crux of the problem then? If you could figure out a way that to align the interests of the shareholders with the investors, we wouldn't be in this
We
pickle.
would not be in that particular thicket.
And is anyone trying to do that?
Well, we at Vanguard actually did that.
Right.
And that is when we created Vanguard back in 1974. We eliminated the management company, actually physically eliminated it. It was there then. There was a company, an outside company running our funds, and ran them with a company that is owned by the fund shareholders themselves. It's what we call mutualization, or what we have is truly mutual funds. And that is created, this doesn't need to be a Vanguard commercial, but that's created for us, just think about this for a minute, of 0.25% a year is our average cost of operating Vanguard. That's the average expense ratio, as we call it, that our fund shareholders pay. Our second lowest competitor charges almost 0.75 of 1%, and the average is over 1.25%. That means that Vanguard has a 1% cost advantage, 1% per year over the average mutual fund. And multiplied by $700 billion of assets, that's a $7 billion a year saving. I mean, it's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
And so it can be done.
But given that so many others are not organized this way, what are some of the things that could be done to try to reduce some of these conflicts so that investors aren't so shortchanged?
Well, what I've been recommending to the Congress, who is deeply involved in this, and also to the SEC, although I believe this governance matter that I'm about to speak of is more a congressional matter, more a matter of legislation than regulation. And I think we need, one, a federal statute of fiduciary duty that says the directors have a fiduciary duty to place the interest of fund shareholders ahead of the interest of the managers, just what the act, carrying out what the act says. I think we need, this is a peculiar one, but believe it or not, typically the chairman of the board of the management company for the fund is also the chairman of the board of the fund. Now, you know there is no way one can negotiate with oneself. And you give your the advantage to the management side. So we need independent chairman for the fund board. We need a majority, a supermajority of fund independent directors. And I would say, deep down, there's no reason that the management company should have any directors in the fund board, but I'm willing to compromise and say the managers could have as many as one director on the fund board. And we also need to give some weight to this director fund shareholder side of the equation. We also need that fund board, reconstituted fund board with an independent chairman and a fiduciary duty to have its own sources of information. We need a staff to monitor the information. And if that had just happened in this scandal area, we never would have had those scandals because the directors would have been getting information that wasn't biased in favor of the management
But
company.
there are plenty of funds where there are independent directors, and some of those have been the ones that have run into trouble. So that alone, it doesn't seem like is sufficient to really stem the tide.
Well, of course you're right. And I don't know how to begin. I mean, what I would really say is we need a new sense of business ethics in the mutual fund industry. We need a new sense of independence. We need a sense of where the director's duties lie with the fund shareholders rather than the management company. And that's not going to happen overnight. But you can't legislate this kind of a spirit or character. But you can create a structure, which I've described, that will be the first step on the long road to getting the fund shareholder back in the driver's seat.
Well, you've really raised the biggest issue of all, which is how does one change the culture of an institution? How do we introduce the concept of ethics back into this business? Because clearly it's gotten lost along the way.
It has been. And I'd say the answer to that, simply put, is one step at a time. And what I proposed is the first step. A lot should follow from that, gradually, not as quickly as we'd like. But once the board gets its feet in the ground and realize it can actually negotiate fees with the management company, we'll be going down that road. The most important part of this is the fee level. And what we know in this industry is, and it's an astonishing fact, and that is while the mutual funds are basically the goose that laid the golden egg for the advisor will sell those same investment management services to corporate pension funds at a cost in ratio that may be a tenth of what the mutual funds are paying, and a cost in dollars that, believe this or not, may be 100 times larger, 100 times more dollars paid to the mutual fund. That's not hyperbole. Paid to the mutual funds for managing money than paid to the pension funds.
Do you feel that the directors that have been on board up till now have had the kind of information that they needed? Did you feel that they were aware of some of these things that were going on? I mean, how much was this just a wink and a nod in the industry?
I think actually what we've suffered from in the mutual fund industry is just a larger edition of what corporate America itself has suffered from. And that is we have CEOs who pose as gods. They are not only the boss of the business, but they're the boss of the board. We have, to put it the way I've often put it, we have turned owners' capitalism, running businesses for the owners, into managers' capitalism. And we have actually institutionalized that structure in the mutual fund business. Because when you think about it, there's no excuse for what happened in corporate America, because 100 large institutions control corporate, 100 large financial institutions own 56% of all the stock in corporate America. And if these owners would just do something, it would happen. There's no such block, if you will, of power in the mutual fund industry. So we have to rely on directors. We've got to have owners' capitalism in the mutual fund industry through the power of the directors.
So you really see them as central to the future. The
directors have to be central, but we've got to spell out their responsibilities. We've got to make them aware of the role of cost. We've got to make sure they understand how much pension plans are saying the same manager. And they also have to be aware of what internally managed funds are charging as compared to externally managed. It's sort of too bad that there's only one internally managed complex, but there will be more, one way or the other.
We'll be right back after this message.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu, That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. Joining us now is Jason Zweig, a columnist with Money Magazine who specializes in mutual funds. Jason, you just were one of the writers on a terrific story that explored corporate governance issues in the mutual fund industry. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the findings that you uncovered?
Yeah, sure, Sarah. One of the things we decided to do after the trading scandals broke in the mutual fund business was tell investors what they have a right to know. Because what all too many American investors forget is if you buy a mutual fund, you actually own the fund. Most people think a Fidelity fund or a T. Rowe Price fund is owned by the firm whose name is on the fund. It's owned by you, the investor, the people who put the money in there. It's your money, and you have a right to know what's being done with it. And there are all too many things that people take for granted as disclosure about other forms of investments that so far you have no right to. You don't know how much money your fund manager has in the fund he runs for you. You don't know how much he gets paid. You also don't know how he gets paid. And so we did a comprehensive survey with dozens of rather invasive questions to see what we could learn about those practices in the fund industry. And in some ways, we found some things that were encouraging, but I would say the main conclusion is there's a lot of work that needs to be done. The fund industry still doesn't really get it.
How responsive were they? Did they immediately say, oh, great that you're asking these questions. We want to come forth and tell everybody how good we are. Were they helpful?
I would say in some ways it was encouraging. Over two-thirds of the 100 largest fund companies, not over two-thirds, but almost two-thirds responded to the survey in one form or another. And some of them told us things that, so far as I know, they had not publicly revealed before. But it was pretty shocking to learn that virtually no major mutual fund company in the country requires portfolio managers to invest in the funds they themselves run.
Now, how important is that? I mean, I think I could make an argument that you don't necessarily want a money manager to invest in a fund, that you want them to be completely impartial. What's the argument there? Do you?
Well, I think the argument is, first, you're entitled to the information. And if your goal is to make sure your portfolio manager is an owner, you ought to know that. And if your goal, as you say, Sarah, is to make sure he's not a manager, not sure how I would defend that, but it would be there. In other words, it's the disclosure itself rather than what is disclosed that's important. But I, for one, thinking about an equity fund manager, and you have to realize this industry has money market funds, municipal bond funds, that where the kind of commitment might be a little bit different. But for an equity fund manager, an actively managed equity fund, it's a little peculiar to think he would not have committed himself or herself to the fund. My general impression is that another advantage comes out if the managers own substantial amounts of the fund, and that is they're apt to spend a lot more time and thought on tax efficiency. And I think the record is not crystal clear on that, but points in that direction. So if your interests are aligned with that of the portfolio manager, I think you've got a fighting chance of doing a little bit better.
So the argument then is, let's get the information out to the public so that they can make an evaluation of whether the manager is deeply invested in. What about changes that have been made? Did you feel that the mutual funds had responded to these scandals and were actively, through their directors and their management, trying to reshape policies, or is it business as usual?
I think we've seen some positive steps. Although I've been very critical of the firm in the past, I think Putnam is a firm that has at least said many of the right things in the wake of this scandal. I think it remains to be seen whether they'll implement them all in a way that's effective, but they've taken some very positive steps with more disclosure, with trying to align the interests of the managers a little bit closer with the interests of the investors. But for the most part, I would say that the fund industry's response is pretty disappointing. And the mutual fund business is going to be dragged kicking, screaming, and squealing and crying into the era when we as investors will be able to learn the same thing about mutual fund managers that mutual fund managers expect to know about the executives of the companies whose stocks they buy.
What is the argument for refusing to give that information? I mean, on what grounds can they say, sorry, we just don't want to divulge that?
Well, I think
What's their defense?
I think the true reason that people are reluctant to disclose it is human nature. They want to keep their own compensation private. They have security concerns, they have safety concerns. They think it's nobody's business. But the exact same objection applies to the chairman of General Electric or General Motors or any other publicly traded company. If any company dared to send out a proxy statement in which executive compensation was not disclosed, not only would every mutual fund manager be up in arms, but I believe that would be a violation of the law. And it's not clear to me why a mutual fund manager should not be subjected to the exact same rule as someone who runs a publicly traded business.
How do you feel about that?
Oh, I agree completely with Jason that we require disclosure. And the reason we don't have it actually is a somewhat subtle one and sort of a hair-splitting one. And that is basically mutual funds as they exist today are just corporate shells. They have no full-time employees. They have no staff. Their officers, believe this or not, are supplied by the management company to the funds. I mean, that's, when you think about that, it's this Gordian knot that gives the managers control over the funds. So the manager is basically saying, you can't pierce our corporate veil. We're a separate company. If we were paid by the funds, it might be okay to disclose it. But we're paid this management fee, and we're paid from the management fee. So they give you this kind of two-step, if you will, and duck. But I think it's very clear that the fund, they have a fiduciary duty to supply the information to the shareholders and the directors, too, whether they're operating in a separate management company or working directly for the fund.
Wouldn't a mutual fund company that said, you know, we're going to go ahead and disclose everything, we're going to put it out there so that everybody knows, wouldn't they get more business that way? Wouldn't it be to their advantage?
Well, that's a great question, and the answer is, I'm afraid, at least at this stage of the industry's development, the answer is no. Because investors, mutual fund investors, don't focus very much on those kind of issues. They focus, unfortunately for them, on one thing, and that is, or most heavily on one thing, and that is the fund's record of past performance. And basically all we know about that past performance is it doesn't repeat. The past is not only not prologue, it's often anti-prologue. The better you did in the past, and we have records to show this at some great length, the better you did in the past, the worse you're likely to do in the future. So if investors would concentrate on it and vote with their feet, you'd have one great industry here. But apparently the investor hasn't gotten the message about what's important and what's not.
Well, and it also goes back to directors. I mean, I think one of the things that's so interesting about the way the mutual fund industry is structured is that a director can be responsible not just for one fund, but for 50, 100, 150 funds. I mean, again,
200.
how do we, 200 in your survey, you probably found that. How can we get that changed, and should we? Does that make sense to you?
Let me say pretty simply, there is absolutely no way on the face of the earth that a director can be a responsible director for 100 or 200 or 300 funds. I mean, how could? I mean, I say the test of a good independent director would be they could name all of the funds they were director of. I don't believe that any director could meet that test. So we very clearly need either a substantial limitation on the number of funds you can be a director of, which I do not believe is the answer, or allow the director to be a director of all the funds in the family, 100 or 200 or more, and have independent information for that director. So the director doesn't have to be watching all the little things in 100 or 200 funds. There's a staff there that says, here's what's going on over here, here's a problem with this fund, no matter how small it is, here's the redemption rate, which will reflect some of this market timing. Over here, this is a lot of public information that the directors never see. So I think that's the solution, independent staff.
Is there a role for an ombudsman in a company? I mean, if you have someone who's clearly been made very publicly available to employees, for example, who see something going wrong, but they're afraid to report it, they're afraid that they're going to get in trouble, they might get fired, they don't feel like picking up the phone and calling a director, is there a place for someone like that, and is that a useful proposal?
I like the idea of the independent staff because it's not clear to me when people recommend the Ombudsman whether it would be an employee of the funds themselves and therefore responsible to the director, or would be paid by the management company. And those are two conceptually very different things. I like the idea of having, if there are shareholder complaints or staff complaints, to go to the people that are in charge of the fund shareholders' interest rather than the manager's interest.
I guess the other question is regulation. Are we in danger, as Congress and others get hold of this issue, of perhaps putting too many strictures on this, so we kill the golden goose? What do you think about that?
Well, Sarah, I think, one of the universal lessons of financial history, and there aren't many, is that there's only one law that's always effective in regulating financial markets, which is the law of unintended consequences. And we haven't seen that one come home to roost here yet, but I'm sure we will. And I think it's important that we try to regulate the right things. And what we're really trying to regulate here is behavior, and we're trying to regulate the alignment of interests between the people who manage the funds and the people who own the funds. And if the regulation is focused exclusively on disclosure and procedure, it's going to miss the point. The point here is that investors own their funds, and until we can encourage the managers to think like owners, they're not going to act in the interests of owners. That's what we need.
That's a great point to end on, and I hope everyone takes heart. Thank you, Jack Bogle, former chairman of the Vanguard Group, and Jason Zweig of Money Magazine, for being with us today. I'll be right back after this break.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
What is perhaps most disturbing about the mutual fund scandal is its sheer scope. So far, it's enveloped 15 mutual funds, 12 brokerage firms, 4 banks, and dozens of individuals. This is not, in other words, just a case of a few greedy executives at the top. For this kind of systemic abuse to have occurred, hundreds of mid-level executives must have actively gone along with these schemes or passively chosen to ignore them. If market timers were hurting the investment performance of fund managers, why didn't they go public with their concerns instead of just accepting it or switching jobs? If brokers were being compensated for pushing funds they thought were unworthy, why didn't they put up a fight? It was their reputations that were on the line. The problem is, standing up for what's right takes guts, and unfortunately that seems to be in short supply these days. Thankfully, there were a few courageous whistleblowers out there who didn't know that. They are the real heroes. We need more of them. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.